Every day for weeks, residents of Frenier in St. John the Baptist Parish in Louisiana heard the local healer and seer, Julia Brown, playing her guitar and singing the same song. It's said that as she was singing, she was putting a curse on the town and that she caused the hurricane that killed hundreds of people. So let's talk about it. The words to her song were, "When I die, I'll take the whole town with me. When I die, I'll take the whole town." Storm warnings were issued via telegraph and mailed on the morning of September 28th, but some people chose not to leave. Also, as the train was going through the town, a newspaper was thrown out to warn everyone about the upcoming hurricane. So on September 29th, 107 years ago, the New Orleans hurricane of 1915 swept in from the Caribbean with winds reaching 130 miles per hour. The city was near the center of the hurricane, which reached a wind speed of 86 miles an hour for about 10 minutes and 120 miles an hour for about 20 seconds. With the hurricane came 8.2 inches of rainfall and a 13-foot storm surge. After the hurricane, it was discovered that the 10-foot-high levee in the Orleans Levee District that was meant to protect the city wasn't actually high enough. The clock on St. Louis Cathedral stopped at 5:50 during the most intense part of the storm. And at the time, it was reported that the storm was the most intense hurricane on record in the history of the Mexican Gulf Coast, and probably in the United States. The train service also stopped, and electricity was knocked out for days. When it was over, the Category 4 hurricane had left behind $5 million in damage in New Orleans and $12 to $13 million for the whole state, or over $300 million in today's money. Not a single town east of New Orleans to Mobile, Alabama escaped some form of damage. Most of their cows and chickens even drowned. 25 people who were seeking shelter at the railroad depot were killed when it collapsed. The death toll was estimated to be around 275 to 350 people throughout the state, with almost 60 in Frenier and 58 in the neighboring town of Rudock alone. And Rudock was a small town that was built on stilts, and it had a population of under 1,000 people. The dead were buried in a mass grave, and supposedly the skeletons occasionally float to the surface and drift down the swamp. Julia Bernard Brown, or Aunt Julia as she was called, died 1 or 2 days before the hurricane, and the hurricane arrived around 4 o'clock that evening on the day of her funeral. Most of the people in town were there, and most of them were killed. Her funeral was actually documented by the New Orleans Times-Picayune in their October 2nd, 1950 issue. It read, "Many pranks were played by wind and tide. Negroes had gathered for miles around to attend the funeral of Aunt Julia Brown, an old negress who was well known in that section and was a big property owner. The funeral was scheduled, and Aunt Julia had been placed in her casket, and the casket in turn had been placed in the customary wooden box, and it was sealed. At 4 o'clock, however, the storm had become so violent that the Negroes left the house in a stampede, abandoning the corpse. The corpse was found Thursday, and so was the wooden box, but the casket never has been found." So who was Julia Brown? She was born Julia Bernard in New Orleans around 1845. She lived and worked in New Orleans in the 1860s before she moved to Frenier. In 1882, she was married. His name was Celestin Brown, and they had 3 children. When her husband died, she inherited 40 acres of land that was granted to her husband by the government. Now, because access to traditional medicine was hard to come by in rural parts of southern Louisiana, Aunt Julia was the town healer. Whenever someone in town needed a doctor, they could pay 25 cents to ride a train to New Orleans, which only ran once or twice a week, or they could go to Aunt Julia. And she used folk medicine to treat a wide range of illnesses and conditions. She would perform a ritual and give the patient herbal remedies and teas made from plants near the swamp, and the person would usually recover quickly. She loved being their healer and would travel around delivering babies and curing infections or whatever was ailing the people of the town. And one herb that she may have used was white willow bark. And willow bark dates back to Hippocrates in 400 BC. With white willow bark, the person would chew on the bark and it would reduce their fever or inflammation. It's still actually used today to treat pain, headache, and inflammatory conditions like bursitis and tendinitis. The bark contains a chemical which is similar to aspirin. And maybe to the people of the town, they thought that she was using magic when she was just using herbal remedies that have been around before Christ. Something else she may have used was wild Louisiana garlic chives. They were helpful in removing anything negative on you or for treating colds or flu. Regardless, the town believed she was powerful, and they believed that she was a voodoo priestess. But after everything that Aunt Julia did for the people of the town, they still didn't see her as a friend. In fact, they were afraid of her. They would stop by for her to help them, but they would look at her strangely whenever they would see her on the street or pass by her house. But soon, the people that she helped would learn how disrespected she felt. After the hurricane, people started to think that maybe the storm was the result of a curse that she had placed on the town because she felt used and taken for granted. On the day of her funeral, the entire town was there, as I said before, and maybe they were hoping that their attendance would ward off the curse that they heard her singing on her porch. But unfortunately for them, it appeared to have a different effect. As the nails were hammered into her coffin, the hurricane ripped through the entire town. Only 2 people in the town survived because they were out of town. One former resident who left during the storm recounted his experience from New Orleans. He said the water was washing in the front door. We thought we were gone. All the camps down there gone. On the big lake that had big timber, big cypress timber. It was just like a break bore went along there. I'll bet that storm flowed every bit 120 or 30 miles an hour. You could hear it come across the South Pass when it hit our place, just like a freight train. Aunt Julia's reputation may have been tainted by a man named Wayne Norwood, and he was a police lieutenant and also the owner of Louisiana Treasures Museum in Ponchatoula. He has said that much of what is said about her is false and that he is the one responsible. He has since apologized for that. In 2015, he wrote, "The Daytime Stood Still, the Hurricane of 1915, and it talks about the story of a storm survivor, Helen Schlosser Berg. Frenier had a German immigrant population, and John the Baptist Parish was once known as Schlosser. It was named after a German immigrant named Martin Schlosser. After his book was published, television producers visited him wanting to film a program about the storm of 1915. In the book, he talked about Julia Brown, and they said, well, look, can we just say that she was some kind of voodoo person or something? And he said, I don't care, you can, it's just a TV show. But according to Berg, Aunt Julia's predictions about the deaths were nothing more than coincidence. And she remembered Aunt Julia sitting on her front porch and playing her guitar and singing songs that she'd make up. The townspeople were supposedly afraid of her because they didn't know whether she was foretelling future events or if she was actually placing a curse on the town. Aunt Julia always seemed to know when something bad was coming. But today, Frenier and Rudock are ghost towns. Some believe her curse has kept the towns from ever coming back or thriving. And the only way that you can see the mass grave is by taking a tour with the Manchac Swamp Tour Company. They purchased the land that the cemetery is on, and on the tour you can also see the cabin where Julia lived.